August 8th, 1944. Normandy, France. Darkness cloaks the dirt road south of Caen. A thick fog clings to the dense hedgerows, twisting the landscape into ghostly shapes. The ground trembles slightly. The low, guttural growl of Maybach engines breaks the silence. A column of German armor is on the move. Leading the pack is a 57-ton steel monster, a Tiger I. Behind it trail the more agile Panzer IVs, their long 75mm barrels pointed menacingly into the gloom. Inside the Tiger's turret, the air is thick with the smell of oil and cordite. The German tank commander squints through his periscope, trying to pierce the night. In his mind, and in the minds of his crew, this is a familiar hunt. They are the apex predators of the battlefield. They have crushed Poland, swept across France, and spread terror across the frozen steppes of Russia. Who is their opponent tonight? Thin-skinned American Shermans? Slow British Cromwells? To the German tanker, these are merely mobile target practice. One 88mm shell from this Tiger can turn any Allied tank into a burning scrap heap from 2 kilometers away. They are not afraid. They are confident. They are, perhaps, even arrogant. But tonight, the script has been rewritten. Suddenly, a blinding greenish flash tears through the darkness from the hedgerow to the left. No warning shot. No time to react. A deafening crack rings out, sharp and brutal like a sledgehammer striking an anvil. The lead Tiger shudders violently. A small, neat, but lethal hole appears right on its 100mm thick frontal armor, a plate considered impenetrable. Inside, hell breaks loose. Ammunition cooks off. Flames erupt from the hatches. The giant steel beast, the pride of German engineering, has been neutralized in a fraction of a second. The remaining panzers panic. Turrets spin wildly, searching for the enemy. "Panzerfaust? Infantry ambush?" screams a voice over the radio. "No! The range is too far. Is it a Sherman? Impossible. A Sherman 75mm can only scratch our paint at this distance." A second flash. Then a third. This time, a Panzer IV's turret is blown clean off. The German tanks, the supreme hunters, are now being slaughtered by an invisible executioner. An enemy that does not show itself, delivering death sentences that slice through the thickest steel. In that chaotic moment, recognizing the flat trajectory and the terrifying velocity of the rounds, the surviving German soldiers realize the truth. A cold dread runs down their spines. It isn't the Americans. It isn't the British. It is the ghosts wearing the red ensign. It is the Canadians. Why did German panzer crews, the battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht and the fanatical Waffen-SS, men who had faced waves of Soviet T-34s without flinching, begin to whisper warnings to each other about these opponents from across the Atlantic? Why, in blood-stained war diaries found years later, alongside fears of Yabos, fighter bombers, do we find trembling entries about the Canadian tank hunters? The truth is, the Canadian Army did not enter the Second World War as a military superpower. They did not possess tens of thousands of tanks like the United States, nor did they field super tanks with heavy armor like the Germans. From the outside, their equipment looked ordinary, even borrowed. The Sherman tanks they drove looked identical to the ones used by the Americans, tanks the Germans mockingly called Ronsons because they lit up so easily. But hidden beneath that ordinary exterior was a lethal difference. The Canadians brought a secret weapon to the European theater. It wasn't a new tank chassis, but a deadly combination. They paired the firepower of the Allied forces' most powerful anti-tank gun, the British 17-pounder, with a ruthless ambush doctrine, iron discipline, and a cold aggression on the battlefield. They turned ordinary Shermans into Firefly assassins. They transformed thin-skinned M10s into stalkers of the night. And most importantly, they shifted the tactical mindset from nightly tank duels to hunter-killer operations. To the Canadians, honor wasn't found in a fair fight. Honor was found in destroying the target before it even knew you were there. In this video, we won't just list dry technical specs. We are going deep into the fog of war, inside the cramped turrets, to understand the true horror felt by a Panzer crew when they realized they were being hunted by Canadians. What made these Canadian armored units the nemesis of the Panzer Force? How did an army often considered second string manage to break the back of German armor in the brutal battles of Normandy, the Scheldt, and the Rhineland? And why did even the most famous German Panzer aces learn to hesitate when they saw the maple leaf ahead? The answer lies in the darkness of the Normandy nights, in the crack of the 17-pounder, and in the untold story of the bravest tank hunters of World War II. Welcome to the story of the Panzer's nightmare. To understand why the Canadians became such effective hunters, we first have to understand where they started. They didn't begin the war as masters of armored warfare. In fact, in 1939, Canada's armored force was virtually non-existent, equipped with only a handful of obsolete tanks from the First World War. Canada was a nation of volunteers, a small dominion standing in the shadow of giants. Yet, they were tasked with building an army that could stand toe-to-toe with the mechanized might of the Third Reich. This transformation wasn't smooth. It was forged in fire and paid for in blood. The trauma of Dieppe, a hard lesson learned. The first major lesson, and perhaps the most painful one, came on August 19, 1942, at the port of Dieppe. This raid was meant to be a test of Allied capabilities, but for the Canadian tank crews of the Calgary Regiment, it became a massacre. Their Churchill tanks, heavy and slow, struggled on the Churt beaches. They were immobilized, trapped, and picked off one by German coastal guns. It was a disaster. But for the survivors and the strategists back home, Dieppe was a wake-up call. It taught the Canadian High Command a crucial lesson that would define their later doctrine. You cannot brute force your way through a prepared German defense. If you charge a Panzer or an anti-tank gun head-on, you die. To win, you have to be smarter. You have to use the terrain. You have to hit them where they aren't looking. The seeds of the hunter mentality were planted on the bloody stones of Dieppe. The tools of the trade, improvisation over innovation. Unlike the Germans, who were obsessed with building bigger, heavier, and more complex tanks like the Panther and the Tiger, Canada had to play the hand it was dealt. They relied on American and British industrial output. The backbone of the Canadian armored force was the M4 Sherman. It was reliable, easy to repair, and available in large numbers. But in a straight fight against a German Panther, the standard Sherman was woefully outgunned. Its 75mm shell would bounce off a Panther's frontal armor like a pebble off a windshield. The Canadians knew this. They didn't try to pretend their tanks were invincible. Instead, they focused on outgunning. They embraced the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon capable of punching through a Tiger tank's armor from a kilometer away. While the Americans were hesitant to adopt the Firefly, a Sherman modified to carry this massive gun, the Canadians, along with the British, deployed them as quickly as possible. They also utilized the M10 tank destroyer and later the Achilles, an M10 with a 17-pounder. These vehicles had open-topped turrets and thin armor. To a novice crew, an M10 was a death trap. To a skilled Canadian crew, it was a sniper rifle on tracks. Because it had no armor to rely on, the crew had to kill the enemy first. The formation of the hunters. By 1944, as the invasion of Europe loomed, the 1st Canadian Army and the 2nd Canadian Corps had organized specific anti-tank regiments. These weren't just standard tank units, these were specialists. They combined towed anti-tank guns, hidden in bushes and dugouts, with mobile tank destroyers. Their doctrine evolved from the static defense of World War I into a fluid, aggressive defense. They learned that a panzer is most dangerous when it is moving and shooting. But a panzer is most vulnerable when it is blind. The classroom of Italy and the hedgerows. Before landing in Normandy, many Canadians cut their teeth in the brutal Italian campaign. At the Battle of Ortona, Canadian tankers learned to fight in the claustrophobic streets of a destroyed city. They learned mouse-holing, blasting through walls to avoid the streets. They learned that in close quarters, a clever ambush beats superior armor every time. Then came Normandy, the bocage country, a maze of high, thick hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. For the attacking Allies, it was a nightmare. But the Canadians realized that this terrain could be turned against the Germans. If a Tiger tank wanted to move, it had to use the roads or break through the hedges, exposing its weaker side armor. The Canadians became masters of the keyhole shot. They would position a Firefly or an anti-tank gun looking through a tiny gap in the hedge, waiting for a German tank to cross their narrow field of view. Students became masters. By the time the Canadian Army pushed out of the Juno beachhead and moved toward Caen, they were no longer the inexperienced volunteers of 1939. They were hardened veterans who understood the asymmetry of armored warfare. Canada didn't enter the war with an empire of tanks mindset. They entered as students, but through the trauma of Dieppe, the grit of Italy, and the tactical hell of the hedgerows, they unintentionally graduated as masters in the art of panzer hunting. But courage and tactics alone aren't enough when you are staring down a 57-ton Tiger. To truly make a German crew panic, you need a weapon that can ignore their armor. You need a can opener. And in the summer of 1944, the Canadians brought exactly that to the battlefield. To understand the fear that gripped a German panzer crew in late 1944, you have to understand the mathematics of their survival. For years, German tankers operated with a comfortable equation. A Tiger I had 100 millimeters of frontal armor. A Panther had a sloped glacis plate that effectively doubled its thickness. Against a standard American Sherman with a 75 millimeter gun, the math was simple. The German tank was invulnerable from the front at almost any range. A Sherman crew had to close within suicidal distances, sometimes less than 500 meters, and flank the German tank to have even a prayer of knocking it out. This created a sense of invincibility among the Panzerwaffe. They were the knights in shining armor, and the Allies were peasants with pitchforks. But when the Canadians arrived in force, they brought a weapon that shattered that equation. They brought the can opener. The 17-pounder, the equalizer. The star of this horror show was the Ordnance QF 17-pounder. It was, without a doubt, the most effective anti-tank gun fielded by the Western Allies during the war. While the Americans were debating the need for heavier guns, the British and Commonwealth forces realized early on that the German cats, the Tigers and Panthers, needed to be put down. The 17-pounder was a beast of a gun. It fired a solid shot at a velocity of 2,900 feet per second. But its true terror lay in a special type of ammunition supplied to Canadian crews, the APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot. Imagine a dart made of tungsten, one of the hardest metals on Earth, encased in a light sleeve. When fired, the sleeve falls away, and that tungsten dart flies at hypersonic speeds. It didn't just hit a tank, it punched through it like a hot needle through butter. For a German crew, this changed everything. Suddenly, the thick steel plate protecting them was no longer a shield, it was just extra weight. A 17-pounder could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger I from 1,000 meters away. The math had changed. The distance of safety was now zero. The Sherman Firefly, the wolf in sheep's clothing. The most famous carrier of this gun was the Sherman Firefly, and for the Germans, this was the most insidious weapon on the battlefield because of one simple fact: deception. Putting a massive 17-pounder gun into a standard Sherman turret was an engineering nightmare. It was cramped, the recoil was violent, and they had to cut a hole in the back of the turret just to fit the radio. But it worked. From a distance, a Firefly looked almost identical to a standard, harmless Sherman, and the Canadians knew how to exploit this. They knew that German tank commanders were trained to prioritize the long-barreled tanks first, so Canadian crews engaged in a deadly game of camouflage. They used counter-shading. They painted the bottom half of the long barrel white and the top half olive drab, or sometimes just painted a false muzzle brake halfway down the barrel. From the perspective of a German gunner looking through a shaking optic 800 meters away, the barrel looked short. It looked like a standard 75mm Sherman. Imagine the psychological impact. A German Tiger commander scans a field. He sees 5 Shermans. He thinks, "Standard tanks, I have time." He picks a target. But one of those standard tanks is actually a Firefly. While the Tiger traverses its turret, the Firefly gunner has already laid his crosshairs on the Tiger's ammo rack. Crack. The Tiger explodes before the commander even finishes his sentence. The Firefly was a priority target for the Germans. They feared it so much that they ordered their troops to focus all fire on any Sherman with a long gun. But thanks to Canadian camouflage and tactics, they often didn't know which one was the Firefly until it was too late. The Achilles and M10, the snipers on tracks. While the Firefly was a brawler, the Canadians also fielded specialist tank destroyers, specifically the M10 and its upgraded cousin, the Achilles. The M10 was built on a Sherman chassis, but featured a distinct, angular, open-topped turret. The Americans often used these for infantry support or massed barrages. The Canadians used them as snipers. The Achilles was an M10 rearmed with that terrifying 17-pounder. These vehicles had very thin armor. A hit from almost any German gun would kill the crew. This vulnerability forced Canadian crews to adopt a hyper-aggressive yet cautious mindset. They couldn't afford to be seen. They utilized the hull-down position masterfully. They would creep up behind a ridgeline until only their turret and gun were visible, fire a shot, and immediately reverse back down before the enemy could return fire. This was the shoot and scoot tactic. To a German column moving through the narrow lanes of Italy or the dikes of the Netherlands, the M10s were ghosts. One moment the road is clear. The next, a high-velocity shell tears the track off the lead Panther. The Germans return fire, blasting the ridgeline, but the M10 is already gone, relocating to a new position to take a shot at the rear of the column. The invisible killers, towed anti-tank guns. We cannot forget the towed guns. In the tangled bocage, hedgerow country of Normandy, a tank was often a liability. It was loud and large. A towed 6-pounder or 17-pounder anti-tank gun, however, was silent and low to the ground. Canadian anti-tank regiments were masters of the ambush. They would drag these heavy guns into the thickest bushes, covering them with foliage until they were invisible from 5 meters away. They would wait. This required nerves of steel. Imagine being a gun crew, protected by nothing but a metal shield and a few sandbags, watching a 57-ton Tiger tank rumble toward you. The ground shakes. The noise is deafening. If you fire too early, the shell might bounce, and the Tiger will turn its machine guns on you. If you wait too long, you might be crushed. Canadian doctrine emphasized holding fire until the absolute last second, often engaging at ranges of less than 200 meters. At that range, a 17-pounder shot didn't just penetrate, it shattered the enemy tank. From the German perspective, this turned every bush, every shadow, and every corner into a potential death sentence. They couldn't see the muzzle flash until the shell had already hit them. It induced a state of constant, grinding paranoia. The psychological shift, from hunter to prey. This arsenal, the Firefly, the Achilles, the hidden AT guns, created a fundamental shift in the dynamic of the war. In 1940 and 1941, the Panzer crews were the hunters. They dictated the pace of the battle. But by late 1944, against the Canadians, they were the prey. The Canadians denied the Germans the one thing their tanks were designed for, the long-range duel. By using the Firefly's range to snipe, or the hidden guns to ambush, they stripped away the German armor advantage. A German tank commander wrote in a letter home, paraphrased from historical accounts, "You see nothing, then a flash, and then Müller's tank is burning. We cannot fight what we cannot see. The Tommies, British Canadians, are getting smarter. They don't play fair anymore." That was the point. The Canadians weren't interested in playing fair. They were interested in winning, and they had found the tools to do it. But tools are useless without the will to use them. To truly understand why the Germans feared the Canadians specifically, we have to look at how they used these weapons in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. It wasn't just the gun, it was the ferocity of the men pulling the trigger. Weapons and specifications are one thing, but the true test of any tank hunter is the chaos of the battlefield. It is one thing to hit a target on a firing range. It is another to do it while artillery is raining down, the ground is turning to mud, and the enemy is the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division. The reputation of the Canadian tank hunters wasn't built on paper. It was forged in 3 distinct hells, where they proved that the Panzer was not invincible. Hell number 1, the Italian shooting gallery. Before the famous hedgerows of France, the Canadians faced the mountains of Italy. This was not tank country. It was a nightmare of narrow mountain passes, ancient stone villages, and fortified valleys. The Germans, master defenders, used this terrain to create lethal kill zones. They buried Panther turrets in concrete bunkers, the Gothic line, and positioned Tiger tanks at the ends of long, straight roads. They expected the Allies to be stalled for months, but the Canadians adapted. At the Battle of the Leary Valley and the assault on the Hitler line, Canadian armored regiments threw out the rulebook. They realized they couldn't outrange the Germans in these corridors, so they outmaneuvered them. They used the M10 tank destroyers not just as defensive weapons, but as assault guns. They crawled up rocky slopes that German commanders deemed impassable for armor. Imagine the shock of a Panzer crew, comfortably positioned to cover the main road, suddenly taking fire from a steep ridge on their flank. In one engagement near the Melfa River, a small force of Canadian tanks and infantry held off a massive German counterattack. The narrow terrain forced the panzers to move in single file. The Canadian 17-pounders, hidden in the rubble of bombed-out farmhouses, turned the lead Panther into a burning cork, bottling up the entire column. The hunters became the hunted, trapped in a narrow lane with no escape, picked apart by invisible gunners. Hell number 2, the grudge match of Normandy. If Italy was the classroom, Normandy was the final exam, and the opponent was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This was a personal war. The 12th SS had executed Canadian prisoners of war in the early days of the invasion. A cold, burning hatred existed between these two forces. When they met in battle, quarter was neither asked for nor given. The climax came during Operation Totalize in August 1944. The Canadians did something insane. They launched a massive armored attack at night. Tanks are blind at night. But the Canadians used artificial moonlight, bouncing giant searchlights off the clouds to illuminate the battlefield with a ghostly glow. They advanced in tight columns, bypassing German strongpoints. When the sun rose, the German panzers woke up to find Canadian Fireflies and Achilles tank destroyers already deep behind their lines. The chaos was absolute. It was in battles like these, near Saintonge and the Verrières Ridge, that the Firefly myth became a terrifying reality for the Germans. Michael Wittmann, the legendary Black Baron and the most famous Tiger ace of the war, met his end in this sector. While historians debate exactly who fired the fatal shot, whether it was British yeomanry, Canadian Sherbrooke Fusiliers, or Polish armor, The context is what matters. Whitman led a counterattack into an Allied trap. He was ambushed from the flank by hidden 17-pounder guns. That moment symbolized the shift in the war. The greatest German tank ace, a man who had destroyed over 130 tanks, was not killed in a glorious duel. He was killed by a hidden gunner in a Sherman Firefly variant, engaging from a concealed position in a hedgerow. The lesson was clear. The era of the invincible Panzer ace was over. The era of the tank hunter had begun. The Falaise Pocket, the corridor of death. As the German army in Normandy collapsed, they tried to flee through a narrow gap near the town of Falaise. The Canadians were the northern pincer, tasked with closing this trap. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Germans were desperate to escape. Their columns were a mix of Tigers, Panthers, horse-drawn carts, and stolen French cars. Canadian armored divisions, specifically the 4th Canadian Armored Division, positioned themselves on the high ground overlooking the escape routes. It became a turkey shoot. Canadian crews described firing their machine guns until the barrels glowed red. But for the tank hunters, the targets were the panzers trying to spearhead the breakout. Fireflies sat hull down on the ridges, systematically destroying any German armor that tried to push through. A German survivor described the scene. It was a corridor of death, burning steel everywhere. If you moved, you died. The Canadians were relentless. They didn't stop to rest, they just kept firing. By the time the gap closed, the once mighty panzer divisions that had terrorized Europe were reduced to smoking heaps of scrap metal littering the French countryside. Hell number 3, the mud of the Scheldt. Perhaps the most impressive and terrifying feat of the Canadian tank hunters came later in 1944, during the Battle of the Scheldt. This was a battle for the ports of Belgium and the Netherlands. The terrain was flooded, flat, and muddy. It was widely considered impossible for tank warfare. The Germans believed they were safe behind the dikes and canals. The Canadians proved them wrong again. They became water rats. They used amphibious vehicles, buffaloes, to flank German positions, but they also dragged their armor through mud that was waist deep. In these conditions, a heavy Tiger tank was a liability. It sank. It bogged down. The lighter Sherman, with its wider tracks, using duckbill extenders, could keep moving. Canadian tank hunters used the dikes as cover. They would creep an Achilles up the reverse slope of a dike, peek the 17-pounder over the top, fire a shot across the flooded plain at a silhouette on the horizon, and vanish back down. In the Battle of the Hochwald Gap, later in the Rhineland campaign, the fighting was so intense that it was described as a meat grinder. The Germans threw their last reserves of heavy armor into the fight. But the Canadian crews, now veterans of Italy and France, didn't flinch. They used the mud to their advantage, forcing the Germans onto predictable roads, where pre-sighted anti-tank guns were waiting. The result? A broken spirit. By the spring of 1945, the psychological victory was complete. German POWs captured by Canadians often asked to see the automatic anti-tank guns. They couldn't believe that human crews could reload and fire with such speed and accuracy. They weren't automatic. They were just Canadian crews, drilled to perfection, fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge that if they missed, they died. From the mountains of Italy to the mud of Holland, the Canadians had proven that a panzer could be killed anywhere, at any time. They had turned the entire European landscape into a trap. But to truly understand the depth of this trauma, we have to stop looking from the outside. We have to climb inside the steel coffin of a Panzer IV. We have to listen to the whispers of the men who were on the receiving end of those 17-pounder shells. What was it actually like to be hunted by the Canadians? To truly grasp the magnitude of what the Canadians achieved, we must strip away the maps, the flags, and the strategic overviews. We must climb into the cramped, smelling interior of a Panzer IV or a Panther in late 1944. We must look through the thick, scratched glass of a vision block and try to understand the world through the eyes of a German tanker. For the first half of the war, the Panzertruppe were the kings of the battlefield. They operated with a swagger, a confidence born from the belief that their machines were superior to anything the enemy could field. They were the hunters. But by the time they faced the 1st Canadian Army in the hedgerows of Normandy and the mud of the Scheldt, that confidence had evaporated. It was replaced by a gnawing, constant paranoia. The mathematics of fear. In a tank, your life depends on math. Armor thickness versus penetration capability. Distance versus velocity. For a German crew, the math used to be comforting. If I see a Sherman, I can wait until 800 meters. He cannot hurt me until 400 meters. I am safe. The Canadians destroyed this safety. Imagine the psychological toll of knowing that the safe zone no longer exists. German crews operating in Canadian sectors reported a specific kind of anxiety. When engaging American units, they often feared the overwhelming air power, the Yabos, fighter bombers, that roamed the skies. But when engaging Canadians, the fear was on the ground. It was eye level. It was the fear of the silent death. The 17-pounder APDS round traveled so fast, nearly 3,000 feet per second, that it hit the tank before the sound of the gun firing could reach the crew. There was no whistle of an incoming shell, no warning explosion nearby to help you adjust, just a sudden, violent, metallic impact. Surviving German reports described the sound not as a boom, but as a terrifying crack, like a giant whip snapping against the hull. One moment, you are scanning a tree line. The next, your driver is dead, and the ammunition is cooking off. The randomness of it, the inability to predict where the death blow would come from, shattered the nerves of even the most experienced SS veterans. The Canadian reputation. Word traveled fast in the Wehrmacht. Soldiers talk. In the mess halls and the field hospitals, stories circulated about the different Allied armies. The British were seen as methodical, sometimes cautious. The Americans were viewed as reckless but overwhelmingly supplied. If you destroyed one American tank, 3 more would appear. But the Canadians? The Canadians developed a reputation that was a strange mix of the two, with an added edge of brutality. German intelligence and soldier gossip identified the Canadians as shock troops. This was a hangover from World War I, but it was reinforced in World War II. After the atrocities committed by the 12th SS Panzer Division against Canadian prisoners in the early days of Normandy, the Canadian armored divisions fought with a cold, ruthless fury. A captured German officer in the Falaise pocket reportedly remarked, "The Americans fight to go home. The British fight for king and country. The Canadians fight like they are angry." For a panzer crew, this meant that surrendering or retreating wasn't always an option. When you saw the red ensign, you knew the enemy was going to close the distance. You knew they were going to use the terrain aggressively, and you knew they weren't going to stop just because the sun went down. The Firefly paranoia. This reputation manifested in a specific battlefield behavior: target fixation. German tank commanders were drilled to scan for the long barrel of the Firefly. This created a psychological hesitation. Imagine a German gunner looking through his sights. He sees 3 Shermans moving across a field. In 1942, he would just shoot the closest one. In 1944, facing Canadians, he pauses. He squints. Is the second one a Firefly? Is that muzzle brake real or painted on? Is the third one hiding behind the hedge and Achilles? That split second of hesitation, that frantic mental calculation, was often the difference between life and death. The Canadians weaponized this paranoia. They knew the Germans were looking for the big gun, so they used the standard Shermans as bait, drawing the German fire while the Fireflies sat still, camouflaged, waiting for the Panzers to reveal their muzzle flashes. The claustrophobia of the hedgerows. The environment intensified the fear. In the bocage and later in the forests of the Rhineland, the war was fought at point-blank range. Inside a panzer, visibility is terrible. You are essentially looking at the world through a straw. When fighting in the open Russian steppes, the superior German optics gave them an advantage. But in the dense terrain where the Canadians excelled, those optics were useless. A German diary entry captured from the Scheldt campaign describes the feeling. The mud is everywhere. The engine strains. We cannot see more than 50 meters. Every bush could be a tank destroyer. Every shadow could be a Canadian with a Piat. We are blind giants, stumbling in the dark, waiting for the hammer to fall. The Canadians were masters of silence. They would turn off their tank engines and wait for hours, listening for the squeak of German tracks. For the German crews, the silence of the Canadian lines was more terrifying than the noise of the American lines. Silence meant the hunters were waiting. The breakdown of the Übermensch. Ultimately, the Canadian tank hunters achieved something strategic. They broke the myth of the Übermensch, superhuman, within the Panzer Corps itself. The propaganda reels in Berlin showed Tiger tanks as invincible machines, piloted by Aryan heroes. But the reality in the field was a dirty, muddy struggle for survival against an enemy that refused to play by the rules of quote-unquote knightly warfare. When a Tiger tank, a machine that cost hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks and thousands of man-hours to build, was knocked out by a Canadian farm boy in a thin-skinned M10 using a well-placed ambush shot, it destroyed morale. It proved that technical superiority could not overcome tactical brilliance and sheer grit. The fear wasn't just about dying, it was about the helplessness. The feeling that no matter how thick your armor was, the Canadians had a way to get through it. They were like wolves taking down a bear, nipping at the flanks, hiding in the brush, striking the hamstrings, and bleeding the beast dry. By the time the Canadians crossed the Rhine, the sight of a Sherman Firefly did not just provoke a tactical response, it provoked a visceral, gut-level dread. The panzer crews knew that inside that unevenly shaped, painted-up Allied tank sat a crew that knew exactly how to kill them, and had the weapon to do it. They had ceased to be the masters of the battlefield. They were just targets waiting for the 17-pounder to crack. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the landscape of Europe was littered with the rusting carcasses of the once mighty Panzerwaffe. The Tigers, Panthers, and King Tigers, machines built to last 1,000 years, were reduced to scrap metal, waiting to be melted down to rebuild the very cities they had destroyed. But amidst the silence of the post-war world, a new understanding began to emerge. Historians, military strategists, and surviving soldiers began to analyze what had actually happened in the tank battles of Western Europe. The narrative that had dominated the early years of the war, that German technology was superior and Allied armor was inferior, was proven to be incomplete. Yes, the Germans built better tanks, but the Canadians proved that you don't need a better tank to win a tank war. You need a better doctrine, and you need men brave enough to execute it. The formula for victory. The legacy of the Canadian tank hunters is not defined by a single piece of equipment. It wasn't just the 17-pounder gun, although that was the tool that leveled the playing field. It was the unique Canadian formula of war that terrified the enemy. They combined the industrial might of the American supply chain, the technological ingenuity of the British weaponry, and a uniquely Canadian tactical aggression. They were the only army to fully embrace the hunter-killer philosophy at every level, from the individual tank commander hiding his Firefly in a barn, to the corps commanders planning massive night operations like Total Eyes. They proved that a smaller, volunteer army could punch far above its weight class. Canada did not have the endless manpower of the Soviet Union or the limitless resources of the United States. They had to be smarter. They had to be more efficient. And in doing so, they earned a distinction that few other Allied units achieved: the specific, targeted fear of the German SS. The human cost of the hunt. We must not forget the human face of this legacy. The men who sat inside the Shermans and M10s were not born warriors. They were farm boys from the prairies, fishermen from the Maritimes, and factory workers from Ontario. Most were in their early 20s. They knew the odds. Every time they climbed into a Sherman Firefly, they knew they were sitting on a priority target. They knew that if a German gunner saw them, he would ignore every other tank to kill them first. Yet, day after day, from the beaches of Juneau to the banks of the Rhine, they started their engines. They fought a war of nerves. They lived in a world of constant, high-stakes hide-and-seek, where a single mistake meant being incinerated in a steel box. The courage required to hold fire until a tiger was 200 meters away, watching a monster grow larger in your sights, knowing that if you miss, you don't get a second chance, is almost impossible to comprehend today. A lesson for the future. The tactics pioneered by Canadian tank hunters are still studied in military academies. The concept of using light, mobile assets to ambush heavier, superior forces is a cornerstone of modern asymmetric warfare. They showed the world that heavy armor, no matter how thick, is vulnerable to an enemy who knows how to use the terrain. But perhaps their greatest legacy is the respect they carved out of the enemy. In the final analysis of World War II, the German panzer crews, proud, arrogant, and skilled, were forced to admit that they had met their match. They were not beaten by a wave of steel or overwhelmed by sheer numbers alone in the Canadian sectors. They were outfought. They were outsmarted. They were hunted down. The final image. Imagine a quiet field in Normandy today. The hedgerows are still there, thick and green. The cattle graze where furious tank battles once raged. If you look closely, you might find a rusted piece of track link or a scarred stone wall. But the true monument isn't in the metal. It's in the silence that reigns where the monsters once roared. The Canadian tank hunter was an anomaly in military history, an underdog who refused to accept his status. He took a borrowed tank, a big gun, and a map, and he went out to hunt the most dangerous game on Earth. And he won. In the annals of war, the Tiger tank will always be remembered as a symbol of terrified power. But let history also remember the answer to that power. Let it remember the flash from the hedgerow, the crack of the 17-pounder, and the maple leaf painted on the side of the hull. For the panzer crews who lived through the nights of 1944, the war didn't look like a glorious charge. It looked like a shadow waiting in the dark. And that shadow was Canadian. This is the story of how the students became the masters. This is the story of the Canadian tank hunters.